Good evening. It's 8 o'clock in Yerushalayim. This is WebYeshiva.org, and it's time to begin our shiur in the series leading up to Pesach. This evening, I'm going to speak about gluten intolerance, celiac disease, but as you will quickly understand, the principles of halacha do not relate specifically to gluten intolerance. What we're going to be talking about really is food intolerance in general. It doesn't matter whether it's specifically gluten or something else that you are intolerant of. The principles are the same. We'll see the sources in a moment. If you have any questions in the course of the shiur, feel free to type your questions on chat. I'll see them on my screen, and then I can incorporate the answers into the ongoing shiur. Let me get the sources on the screen. Bring it over here. Yeah. Now, I'm not going to bother to tell you exactly where I draw the sources from, because you have the sources explicitly and in detail on the screen. So if you want to look them up and see what mistakes I made in typing, I'm not a great typist. You can check out the context and see any typing errors by checking out the sources if you wish. We begin with a verse in the Torah, and then we're going to see the understanding of the Chidushei Harim. After we see the verse in the Torah in just a moment, we're going to look at the commentary of the Chidushei Harim. The Chidushei Harim was the first Gerer Rebbe. He was, people might argue, which was the largest Hasidic group before the Holocaust. Perhaps the Alexander Hasidim were a little bit more numerous than the Gerer Hasidim, but he was, if not the founder of the largest Hasidic group in Eastern Europe. Well, not the largest, he's surely second largest. He was not only a great Hasidic Rebbe, but he was also a formidable Talmud Chacham, a formidable rabbinic scholar, and it's fairly unusual to have both of those qualities combined in a single personality: greatness in Hasidism and greatness in halacha and understanding Talmudic and rabbinic sources. Let's see the verse, and then we'll see what he has to say about the verse. And you're going to wonder why I chose this verse, and you're going to wonder what's the connection with food intolerance, but we'll see the connection shortly. It says in the verse, L'ma'an yedu dorosechem, throughout the generations, all Jews have to know, up to our contemporary generation today. Well, not only my generation, I'm an oldster, even your generation, even if you're younger, every generation has to know, Ki besukot hoshavti es bnei Yisrael, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu provided sukkot, booths, protection for the Jews to live in while they were in the wilderness en route from Eretz Mitzrayim, from Egypt to Eretz Yisrael. B'hotziosam me'Eretz Mitzrayim, when HaKadosh Baruch Hu took us out of Egypt, we had Sukkot in the wilderness. Ani Hashem Elokeichem, and this is part of the divine plan. That's what it says in the verse. Now, what does this have to do with our subject today? Initially, you're going to think not very much, but presently we're going to see it's really very closely connected. The verse says, Yedu. It's important for every future generation of Jews to know the story of the Exodus from Egypt and this particular detail as well. And therefore, there's a mitzvah. It's one of the 613 commandments to sit in a sukkah. But it's not enough just to build a sukkah and sit in it. It's not enough just to build a sukkah and eat in it, sleep in it, have conversations and all that's not enough. All of the performance of the mitzvah must be, according to the verse, all of the performance of the mitzvah, eating in the sukkah, sleeping in the sukkah, everything has to be combined with yediah, knowledge, that this is reminding us of the Exodus from Egypt and how our forefathers made it through the wilderness. Now, that's what the verse says. Here comes the commentary of the Chidushei Arim, the first Gera Rebbe. Mishum zeh, because of this, Mishum zeh, because of this, he says, Hare lefi hadin, according to the bottom line halacha, hadin, the minimum requirements of halacha to fulfill the mitzvah of sukkah, hamitztaer, someone who is in pain, someone who is suffering, someone who is hurting. Patur min sukkah is exempt from the mitzvah of sukkah. If you are sick, suffering, in pain, you are exempt from the mitzvah of sukkah. You could eat in your house. You don't need a sukkah. Why? Ki lehamitzaer, because someone who is in pain, someone who is suffering, chaser yeshivadas, someone who is suffering does not have clarity of mind. If you are suffering, you cannot focus your mind on what you're supposed to be thinking about, on what you're supposed to be contemplating. Well, everyone knows that. If you're sick, if you're suffering, and I'm sick, I'm not talking necessarily about a disease, an infection or something. If you have a broken finger, if you whatever the source of your pain is, pain distracts you and makes it difficult to concentrate on what you're supposed to be thinking about and understanding. Well, it follows, therefore, according to the Chidushei Arim, if you are suffering, if you are in pain, doesn't matter whether it's a broken finger or a fever, doesn't matter what's causing you the pain. If you cannot have clarity of thought because of the pain, you are exempt from the mitzvah of sukkah because you won't be able to fulfill the ikar hadin, the fundamental halacha, according to the verse, of remembering and focusing your mind on the Exodus from Egypt and the story of our forefathers as they were going through the wilderness. Hare mamela she'enu yachol lekayem es mitzvah Shatorah Amra Alei Lama'an Yedu. If you're sick, if you're suffering, if you're in pain, you cannot, it's just impossible. You cannot fulfill the mitzvah as required by the verse. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't expect you to do anything which you are unable to do. If you're unable, then you're simply exempt from the mitzvah. In the words of the Gemara, onus Rahmana Patre. Maybe I can type that on chat. Onus Patre. Someone who is unable to fill a mitzvah, doesn't matter why, well, you're simply exempt from the mitzvah. Kodesh Baruch Hu doesn't expect you to do something which you're unable to do. And someone who's sick is simply incapable, simply unable, simply cannot focus his or her mind on the mitzvah, exempt. Okay, now, this is an important halacha for Sukkot. I just mentioned in passing, this shiur is not focusing on Sukkot, but let me just mention in passing that this idea of the Chidushei Arim is more or less universally embraced by all of the great rabbis through the generations. Search long enough, you'll find someone who disagrees with anything. I mean, that's what rabbis do. They disagree with each other. But the overwhelming majority of great rabbis through the generations embrace this idea regarding Sukkot. You're still wondering what this has to do with Pesach, but we're going to come to that. Next, Now I want to begin surveying the opinions of the great poskim through the generations and see how this applies. We begin with Menorat Amor, written by Rav Yitzchak Abuav. He was one of the big names. He was one of the great poskim in Spain back in the glorious days in Spain. He was after the Reconquista, after the Christian reconquest of Spain, back in the days of the Ramban. In any event, let's see what he had to say. Lefi sheratzon borenu. Since our Creator desires, since HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants, shelo nitzta'er b'mitzvot. Since HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants us not to suffer, since HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants us not to have pain when we fulfill the 613 commandments of the Torah, aval nismach b'hem. Instead, HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants us to have simcha. Instead, HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants us to rejoice, have a sense of joy in the fulfillment of the 613 mitzvahs, not pain and suffering. The opposite. We're supposed to have a sense of simcha, a sense of joy in the performance of the mitzvah. Okay, therefore, tzivu la'asota tzilsa meruba mechamosa. Therefore, they, the rabbis of the Gemara, when he says they, he means Chazal, the rabbis of the Mishnah and Gemara, taught us that the schach, the roofing in the sukkah, must give good shade. It has to be better shaded, and the roofing has to let through less sun. The shade area must be greater than the sun area, so that it will be pleasant to sit in the sukkah. If it's not pleasant to sit in the sukkah, if it's unpleasant, painful, causes you distress to sit in the sukkah, well, you're simply exempt. Patru lacholim, and therefore sick people who do not have joy sitting in the sukkah because they have headache, they have fever, they have a broken bone, they have endless medical problems. Doesn't really matter particularly what the medical problem is, but they are mitztarim. They have pain and suffering in the sukkah. They are exempt. Gam holchei drachim. Bizman halichosam. Similarly, people who are traveling. This is the 14th century. Don't think about the way people travel today. But back in those days, you were traveling on foot from town to town, or maybe you had a donkey or a horse. But traveling still is difficult. The traveling was very difficult in those days. Still is difficult today, in my experience, especially if you're traveling with children. But the English word travel, if you know French, then you understand that the fundamental underlying meaning of the word travel is work, hard work. That's what travel means. Traveling involves a lot of work. It's hard to do, especially back in those days, but still today. Still today, that's true. Anyone who knows the French word le travail understands that. But surely you remember Latin from grammar school. Do you remember how to say suitcases, luggage in Latin? The Latin word for luggage, suitcases, is impedimenta. That's exactly what baggage and suitcases are, impedimenta. You got the idea? Now, people who are traveling on Sukkot, Chol Hamoed, well, of course, on the first day, or first 2 days, the last day, and last 2 days you're not traveling, but on the intermediary days of the festival, you might be traveling. You have a lot of work. Well, well, you can't simultaneously be traveling and focus your attention on the knowledge that you're supposed to have of the story of the wilderness. Shomrei Ha'ir, Beit Shmiratam. Similarly, people who are on guard duty, uh, uh, guarding the city. Back in those days, with your sword and bow and arrow. Nowadays, with your submachine gun, those who are on guard duty similarly have to be concentrating their minds on what they're supposed to be doing, keeping a lookout for the enemy who's approaching. Oskim b'mitzvahs, similarly, people who are engaged in other mitzvot. If at the moment you are engaged in the mitzvah of, that doesn't matter which mitzvah, if at the moment you're engaged in the mitzvah of honoring your parents, or visiting the sick, or burying the dead, whatever mitzvah it is, whatever other mitzvah it is that you are engaged in, you're supposed to be focusing your mind on that mitzvah. And therefore, there should be no room in your mind to also divert attention from the other mitzvah, honoring your parents, visiting the sick, burying the dead. There's no room to divert some of your attention to the mitzvah of Sukkah. So you're simply exempt from the mitzvah of Sukkah. HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't expect you to do two mitzvot simultaneously. As long as you're doing one mitzvah, you are connected to HaTorah, to the Torah. As long as you're doing one mitzvah, you are connected to the world of Kedusha, the world of sanctity, and you're simply exempt from simultaneously fulfilling a second mitzvah. The great Chafetz Chaim, the author of the Mishnah Brura, when he was old, he was not well when he was old, and in his home, he had always two students from the yeshiva. Chafetz Chaim was the head of the yeshiva in his town, in the town of Radin. He always had two of the Talmidim, two of the students with him in his house to take care of him. He was very sickly at the end of his life. And there was also a non-Jewish housekeeper who kept the house clean, was also there. One afternoon, the Chafetz Chaim took a nap. He always took a nap in the afternoon when he was old and weak. He woke up from his nap in the late afternoon and looked around the house, and he asked the non-Jewish housekeeper, "Where are the two Talmidim who are supposed to be here to look after me?" And she told the Chafetz Chaim, "Well, they went to the synagogue for the afternoon prayers." To which the Chafetz Chaim responded, "They're supposed to be here taking care of a sick person, namely me. They are exempt from the mitzvah of prayers in the synagogue. They shouldn't have gone there. They should have stayed here to be able to take care of me." Point is, HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't expect you to fulfill two mitzvahs simultaneously, because mitzvahs require da'at, mitzvahs require focusing of the mind, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu only expects you to focus your mind on one thing at a time. Kol zman shem terudim b'mitzvah, as long as your mind is occupied with another mitzvah, honoring your parents, visiting the sick, whatever the mitzvah is, you are exempt from the sukkah. Chatan v'shoshvinav, a chatan, someone just got married, a chassan, and not only the chassan, but all of his friends who are accompanying him for the week of celebration after the chasana, after the wedding. That's what we call nowadays Sheva Brachas, the week of rejoicing after the wedding. Kol Shivas Yemei Sukkah, if they got married just before Sukkot, for the whole 7 days after the wedding, exempt from the mitzvah of sukkah, because the chassan is supposed to be focusing his mind on the kala, on his bride, not on other mitzvahs. Now, let's understand on a conceptual level what's going on here. On the previous screen, we learned that someone who is in pain, someone who is suffering, is exempt from sukkah because you can't focus your mind on what you're supposed to be focusing your mind on. There's no particular reason why on the previous screen we should have extended that idea to other mitzvot, like Leil HaSeder and eating matzah. On the previous screen, the discussion could have been limited strictly to Sukkot and not necessarily expanded to include other mitzvahs. Now, on the current screen, in the Menorah Maor, we see that the underlying idea for the exemption of someone who is mitztaer, the underlying exemption from the mitzvah for someone who is in pain or suffering, is not specifically connected to Sukkot. It's a general principle, a general idea which applies throughout the length and breadth of Torah. If you are suffering, if you are in pain, then there's a good argument that you are exempt from fulfilling any other mitzvah because you can't focus your mind on what you're doing. Let's take this idea one step further. Binyan Shlomo. Binyan Shlomo was one of the big name poskim in Lithuania, in Eastern Europe in the 19th century, and he explicitly and definitively extends the ideas we have been seeing to all the mitzvahs of the Torah, including eating matzah in Leil HaSeder. Let's see his words. Achen, indeed, lo nidati, in my humble opinion, rabbis always express themselves modestly. In my humble opinion, near it would seem, he expresses himself in a very modest way, but of course, no one told him he had to publish this tshuva. The very fact that he chose to publish it means this is his definitive opinion, even though he expresses himself in such a modest way. Indeed, in my humble opinion, it would seem pashut, obvious. It's obvious. De kol kedon ze, anyone who is like this, sick, anyone who is like this, in pain or suffering, talia bahargasha. It all depends in every individual case on how you feel. Uh, there's such a thing as mild distress. There's such a thing as major distress. You can have a little bit of pain or a lot of pain, and only you know the level of your suffering. And the exemption from mitzvahs all depends upon how you feel. You have to decide how much you are suffering. Shemargisha chole ba'atzmo, the sick person, the one in pain or suffering, must decide himself, must decide herself how much pain and suffering, whether or not the level of discomfort is distracting from the performance of the mitzvah. Efsher sheyazik lo im yochal hakezayet matzah umoro. If you feel, and only you know how you feel, if you feel that eating a kezayet of matzah in Leil HaSeder, that's the minimum amount of matzah which has to be eaten to fulfill the mitzvah, if you feel that a minimal fulfillment of the mitzvah of eating matzah, or the minimal fulfillment of the mitzvah of eating moror, bitter herbs, im yelech l'sukkah, or if you feel that going to eat in a sukkah is going to be mazik, is going to hurt you, is going to harm you, is going to make you sick. At the moment, you might be perfectly healthy, but if you feel that performance of the mitzvah is going to make you sick, is going to bring pain and suffering to you, if that's what you feel, az eino rashai lahachmir al atzmo, it's you have no right to be strict and bring pain and suffering upon yourself. The mitzvahs, as we learned on the previous screen, are intended to bring joy to joy to you. And if you feel that performance of the mitzvah is going to do the opposite, is going to make pain and suffering, you are simply exempt, and you should not be strict and do the mitzvah and bring the pain and suffering upon yourself. You should refrain from performance of the mitzvah. And similarly, similarly, even if the patient says, I can do it, I can tolerate the matzah, I'm going to be okay, I'm strong, it's not gonna bother me, even if the patient, yes, this includes emotional suffering as well. That Of course, the problem of emotional suffering usually comes up in honoring one's parents. That should be subject for a different shiur, but the basic idea applies there. If there's a lot of tension between children and parents, and the children attending to the parents is going to make emotional suffering, so the same principles apply. But that deserves a special shiur on another occasion, which we will devote to honoring parents. In any event, the patient says, "I can do it. I'm strong. It's not going to hurt me. I'm not going to. I can do the mitzvah. I'm going to be fine." But the physician says, "I'm not so sure about that." The patient is confident that he or she can fulfill the mitzvah and nothing will go amiss. That's what the patient says, but the doctor says, I'm not so sure about that. The doctor says, I think there might be a bad outcome here if the patient fulfills the mitzvah. Gamkein, even in this situation, shomrim l'rofeh, we listen to what the physician says, even though the patient is perfectly secure, even though the patient is entirely certain, I can do it, it's not going to harm me, it's not going to hurt me, I'm going to be fine. If the physician is in doubt and says, eat the matzah, you might end up with some suffering, you might end up with some pain and distress. Exempt. Eino rashai lachmir alatzmo. Not only are you exempt, but it's wrong to be strict and fulfill the mitzvah anyway. In this case, where you are exempt from the mitzvah, because either you yourself or the physician says, this might hurt you, this might harm you. Well, if you're exempt from the mitzvah and go ahead and do it anyway, you're using God's name in vain when you pronounce the blessing. The blessing is prohibited, is a use of God's name in vain, because you're making a blessing on a mitzvah that for you is no mitzvah at all, and that's wrong, wrong, wrong. You should not be strict and go ahead and do the mitzvah when you are exempt from doing it. L'kayim is a mitzvah. You should not fulfill the mitzvah. This is no different than the rules of fasting on Yom Kippur. The mitzvah of fasting on Yom Kippur, well, I don't have to tell you how important that is. Everyone knows that that's a really important mitzvah. Makom, nonetheless, Kaimalan, nonetheless, we hold, and all the poskim agree, Ma'achilin oto al pi atzmo o al pi bekiyin. All the poskim agree that we feed the patient on Yom Kippur either because the patient says, I feel I need it, or because the physician says, I think the patient needs it. We always we always follow the minimal. We always follow the more lenient opinion, either that of the patient himself, or the patient herself, or that of the physician, whichever is the more lenient opinion. That's the determinative one. Yes, we're going to speak specifically about wine in this story a little bit later. Wine or grape juice. Even though the Gemara is talking about someone who might die on Yom Kippur, even though it's a life and death situation in the discussions regarding Yom Kippur, Makol Makom, in any event, Pashut, it's nonetheless obvious. It's surely true that regarding other mitzvahs of the Torah, even if there's no threat to life, it's only a matter of pain and suffering. If it's only a matter of pain and suffering, then you're exempt from the mitzvah, the performance of which might cause you pain and suffering. Pashut, all this is obvious. Well, it is pretty definitive. According to this, the idea that we learned regarding Sukkot, the idea that mitztaer, someone who is in pain or suffering, is exempt from the mitzvah, or someone who at the moment is not suffering at all, but performance of the mitzvah will bring pain and suffering upon the patient. In either case, you're simply exempt from the mitzvah. On Yom Kippur, the reason on Yom Kippur the discussion is limited to life-threatening conditions is because on Yom Kippur we have also a prohibition to eat. Prohibitions are a little bit stricter than positive commandments. Now we're not talking about a prohibition on Sukkot. Instead, we're talking about what the poskim call kum aseh, rise up and perform the mitzvah, a performative mitzvah. Matzah is a performative mitzvah, something you do, as opposed to something you don't do. If it's a don't do, a thou shalt not mitzvah, a prohibitive mitzvah, there threat to life is required for the leniency. But if it's a thou shalt mitzvah, a mitzvah of something which you do, like sukkah or a matzah, then pain and suffering is an exemption, according to the Binyan Shlomo on the screen today. Now, this is a very interesting opinion. And of course, we immediately wondering, is this the maverick opinion of one great rabbi in Lithuania in the 19th century? Or does this opinion represent the mainstream thinking of contemporary rabbis? That's an important question to answer. Let us then survey the opinions of other great modern rabbis and see whether or not they embrace the opinion of the Binyan Shlomo or not. Let's look first at the Tzitz Eliezer, which I should have right here. Yes, indeed. Tzitz Eliezer. Rav Eliezer Yehuda Waldenberg was his name. He was, for many, many, many years, the head of the Bet Din Agadol. He was the head of the Supreme Court, the Supreme Rabbinic Court of the Chief Rabbinate of Israel. Extraordinarily influential position. And he happened to live just half a block away from the old Shaharei Tzedek Hospital building. If you're familiar with Yerushalayim, you know that on Rehov Yafo, not far from Machne Yehuda, is a large building which today is the Broadcast Authority building. That building used to be the old house for Shaharei Tzedek Hospital before they moved to the current location next to Bayit Vagan. In any event, half a block away from there is where the Tzitz Eliezer lived. And every week he used to give a shiur in the hospital for the physicians and the nurses, for the medical staff, on medical halachic issues. And therefore, his tshuvot, which run to around 29 volumes, his tshuvot, he covered the whole width and breadth of Torah. He wrote about everything imaginable, but much of the contents of his tshuvot deal with medical matters because he was always giving that weekly class in Shaarei Tzedek Hospital, and the medical staff always asked him questions, and he would always answer, and many of the answers ended up as tshuvot in his published works. In any event, there's no need for us to go word by word through the whole tshuva, because basically he is just quoting word for word, well, not exactly word for word, but almost word for word, the opinion on the previous screen. And he says flat out, I am embracing the opinion of the Binyan Shlomo, which we just saw on the previous screen. And he proceeds to paraphrase that opinion. No need for us to go through it again, but we see that the Tzitz Eliezer, one of the leading rabbinic authorities in Eretz Israel, one of the leading rabbinic authorities in the world in the 20th century, totally, completely, and absolutely embraced the opinion of the Binyan Shlomo on the previous screen. If you are in pain or suffering, you are exempt from the mitzvah. Even if you're fine at the moment, but performance of the mitzvah will bring pain and suffering upon you, you are exempt from the performance of the mitzvah. And of course, this idea has to do with all the mitzvahs which are performative in nature. Thou shalt do this, you have to do this, you have to do that. This principle has nothing to do with prohibitions of the Torah. Thou shalt not, you're not allowed to do this, you're not allowed to do that. Regarding the negative stuff, what you're not allowed to do, their threat to life is the criterion which will lead to an exemption. Okay, so we see at least one of the great contemporary rabbis completely embracing the approach of the Binyan Sion and the Binyan Shlomo on the previous screen. Let's see whether we can find an earlier semich. In the study of rabbinic literature, when one finds an interesting idea, like the exemption from a mitzvah, if the mitzvah is going to make pain and suffering, when one finds an interesting idea like this, one always wants to search for earlier sources. Is this an idea which was truly innovated at some point in time? Or is this an idea which has a tradition behind it going back through the generations? Well, the Leket Yosha, back in the 15th century, wrote as follows. He was in Germany. Asher Shaltani, you asked me, he writes, you asked me, Al Dvar Ishtecha, you asked me about your wife, Shetichia, may she live and be well. Im Titchayev B'achilas Matzah Mor. You asked me whether your wife should eat matzah and moror in Leil HaSeder. Why? What's the question? Achareshi regila liot anusha shekorim b'lashon Ashkenaz, because when she eats matzah and moror in Leil HaSeder, she becomes what they call in German ohnmächtig. I happen to know German, so I understand what the German word ohnmächtig means. If you understand German, own means without, mächtig means power or strength. Ohnmächtig literally means without power or strength, but it's the ordinary German word for fainting. If she fulfills the mitzvah of matzah and morah in Leil HaSeder, she faints away, just loses consciousness for a few moments. I feel like she bria. She's healthy. After a few moments, she recovers and she's fine. She's basically healthy. It's just a few moments of fainting, after eating matzah and more. Is this something she should do? And faint and then wake up again? Or kol shekain ata shehaita chole v'chalusha ma'od mikarov, and now at this year she happens to also be sick. She has some infection, she has some fever, I don't know what she has, but in addition to this problem of having passing unconsciousness when she eats matzah and more, this year she happens to be sick. You have to be afraid that if she faints this year, it's going to be worse. Should she eat matzah and more? Da, you have to know. This is his answer. Da, you have to know. Kinira she'ena mechuyevet b'chi agavna klal. She's absolutely exempt. She has absolutely no obligation to eat matzah and more in this condition. No threat to her life. No one thinks she's going to die, but there is a likelihood that it's going to make worse her weakness because she's sick, and every likelihood that she's going to have a brief fainting spell. Raya, a proof for this exemption, is to be found in the Asheri, in the writings of the Rosh, Rabbeinu Asher, the last of the great Baalei Tosafot. The Baalei Tosafot were in France, but Rabbeinu Asher, the last of the great Baalei Tosafot, at the very end of the Middle Ages, he got a job as a rabbi in Spain, so he left France and went with his family to Spain. In any event, Rabbeinu Asher, the last of the great Baalei Tosafot, said, Isa b'Yerushalmi, he quoted the Yerushalmi, Rabbi Yochanan lo hava manach tefillin kol shana rak mepischa lepischa. According to the Gemara, Rabbi Yochanan, one of the great rabbis in the Talmudic period, put on tefillin once a year, around Pesach time in the spring. Once a year in the spring, in the winter it was cold. Springtime it warmed up. As soon as it began to warm up in the springtime, he put on tefillin once a year. And when he put on tefillin once a year, have a chazik reshe, he would then have headaches. From Pesach until Shavuos, he would suffer from headaches. I don't know what his medical condition was, but he always had a hat. He always kept his head very warm, covered. And when it got warm in the springtime, he took off his hat. He took off all the covering. He exposed his head once a year to put on tefillin, and then he suffered for 7 weeks between Pesach and Shavuot. Perush. This means, since all year long he was afraid that uncovering his head would give him headaches. He was afraid that all year long uncovering his head for putting on tefillin would give him headaches. He didn't put on tefillin the whole year. He was just exempt from the mitzvah because it would give him headaches that would last for weeks. The same text continues. The same rule applies regarding your wife, who will suffer and be in pain if she eats matzah and moror. Af al gav the Isa of Mordechai, even though the Mordechai, one of the other great German medieval authorities, the Isa Nami B'Yerushalmi quoted the different passage in the Yerushalmi about Rebbe Yonah. There's another story in the Gemara about Rebbe Yonah, another one of the great rabbis. Kedahava arba kosos, whenever he would drink 4 cups of wine in Leil HaSeder, hava chazik reshe, he had horrible headaches from Pesach until Shavuos. Nonetheless, he drank the 4 cups, even though he knew it would make him suffer for around 7 weeks until Shavuos time. Kol shekain bishvil matzah. The same principle should apply all the more so for matzah. So we have 2 opinions in the Gemara. We have the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan, who, because performance of the mitzvah would give him a headache, simply refrained from fulfilling the mitzvah. And we have the opinion of Rabbi Yonah, who undertook performance of the mitzvah, 4 cups of wine, even though he knew full well that it would give him serious headaches for a few weeks. Rabbi Yochanan nami manach tefillin be'erev Pesach. And if you think about it for a moment, you'll realize that Rabbi Yochanan, the one who felt he was exempt from mitzvah because the mitzvah would cause pain and suffering, once a year he did it. He did fulfill the mitzvah once a year on Erev Pesach in the springtime, even though it would give him a headache. So once a year he did do the mitzvah, not every day. So we have different opinions in the Gemara. Makom, nearer, my bottom line understanding is, Yesh Lamar, we have to say, Dafka Bichai Gavna, de Mida di Dehu, de Efsher Dahaya Koevu Machlish Lahem. Everyone has a different midah, everyone has a different measure of pain and suffering. You have to know, and only you know, how much you can tolerate pain and suffering. Some people have high tolerance levels. Pain and suffering doesn't bother them very much. Some people have low pain tolerance. Only you know how much you suffer when you have pain and when you experience pain as a result of performing a mitzvah. And Rabbi Yochanan felt that his level of pain and suffering was sufficient to exempt him from the mitzvah. Rabbi Yonah didn't. Everyone has to know his own or her own limit in being able to accept pain and suffering as the price of doing a mitzvah. Misha nafsho nase anusha shekorim onmechtik. Surely someone who is going to faint as a result of eating matzah, surely someone who is going to faint as a result of performing the mitzvah, whatever the mitzvah happens to be, that's surely a measure of strong pain and suffering. That's surely sufficient to exempt the person from the mitzvah, even if it's only lif'amim, even if the person doesn't always faint away, but might suffer fainting. Raya, Miri. And the proof is from Rabbi Yochanan in the Gemara, who felt that once a year he could tolerate the pain and suffering resulting from the mitzvah of tefillin. Once a year he felt he could tolerate the pain and suffering from uncovering his head and doing the mitzvah. Well, he knew how much he was suffering. He's the only one who knew how much he's suffering, and he thought he judged himself that he could accept that pain and suffering to do the mitzvah. Al korchach midato kachaya. That was the midah, the measure of suffering that he could tolerate. Rabbi Yochanan could tolerate the result of putting on a mitzvah once a year. Other people higher or lower tolerance for suffering, and only you can decide what you can tolerate. What we've seen so far is that the underlying idea that pain and suffering, either because you have pain and suffering or because performance of the mitzvah will bring pain and suffering upon you, we've seen that this is justification for an exemption from the mitzvah. And we've seen this in a number of important sources. Let's turn now to the 20th century. I want to look at the Igros Moshe, Rav Moshe Feinstein, truly the greatest of the poskim, truly the greatest of the rabbis in North America in the 20th century, truly on anyone's short list of all time great rabbis. Let's see what he has to say about the situation, and these are his words. Aside from my typographical errors, all of my sources are quoted, I hope, word for word correctly. Probably made some mistakes. Nishalti, I was asked, Rav Moshe Feinstein writes, Be'echad, regarding one person. One person was suffering mental disease. I don't know exactly what the diagnosis was here, but as he describes it, it sounds like some kind of schizophrenia. But I don't know. I don't know exactly what the mental disease here is, but the person was suffering. And it was so bad that this person is hospitalized. Well, fortunately, after a time in the hospital, he was cured. The course of treatment in the hospital was successful. Although this person was ill, mentally ill, emotionally ill, and was therefore admitted to the hospital, the person is now cured and fine. So here we have a recovered patient. The patient was suffering, therefore hospitalized, treated in the hospital, and now is fine. We're after the cure. However, harofim omrim, the physicians in the hospital say, tzarich liot sham od eze shvuot tachat hashgachatam. The doctors and the physicians in the hospital say, he's cured, he's now fine, but we don't want to release him, maybe it was a woman, her, we don't want to release the patient so quickly from the hospital. We want to keep the patient under observation for a few more weeks to make sure that the condition does not reappear. There should not be any relapse in the disease. At the moment, the patient functions fine. At the moment, the patient is perfectly normal. But we want to keep the patient under observation for a few weeks before releasing the patient into the general population just to make sure there's no relapse. If there is a relapse, we want the patient to be here in the hospital when it happens. We don't want to release the patient lest he or she have a relapse and just going to make matters worse. The question now is, is there any reason to take the patient out of the hospital? The patient is fine, just under observation, lest he or she experience a relapse. Should we take the patient out of the hospital, kedei sheyikayem mitzvah shofar, so that the patient can hear the shofar on Rosh Hashanah? Rosh Hashanah is falling during the couple of weeks when they want to keep the patient under observation in the hospital. But for some reason, it's impossible to bring a shofar to the hospital. I guess it's far away. There's no one there to blow the shofar for the patient. In any event, for some reason, it's impossible for the patient to fulfill the mitzvah of shofar on Rosh Hashanah in the hospital. Should we take the patient out of the hospital for 2 days so that he or she can hear the shofar, and then after Rosh Hashanah, the patient will go back into the hospital for observation? That's the question. Heshavti. Answer. Here is the reply. Lani Adati, in my humble opinion, he expresses himself modestly, in my humble opinion, ein tzrichim lahotzio. There is no need, no reason to take the patient out of the hospital. Let the patient stay in the hospital and forget about the mitzvahs of Rosh Hashanah. Forget about the mitzvah of shofar. Don't make any effort to fulfill the mitzvah. Ki alase gam ones mammon yoter mechomish nechshav keonis. Because the Gemara, the Rambam, the Shulchan Aruch, and all the poskim teach us that ones mammon, financial pressure, is sufficient to exempt a person from a mitzvah. What is financial pressure? If performance of the mitzvah is going to cost you money, if the performance of the mitzvah is going to cost you more than chomish, more than 20% of your net worth, figure out the value of your house and everything you own and your bank accounts. If performance of the mitzvah is going to cost you more than 20% of your net worth, you are simply exempt from the performance of the mitzvah. That's what it says in the Gemara. That's what it says in the Rambam. That's what it says in all the poskim. That's what it says in the Shulchan Aruch. If the only way to fulfill the mitzvah of etrog on Sukkot is going to cost you, that esrog is going to cost you more than 20% of your net worth, you're simply exempt from buying an etrog and fulfilling the mitzvah. Well, if financial pressure exempts you from fulfilling a mitzvah, imkain, it follows, kol shekain, all the more so, שעדיף לאדם אף מחומש ממון יותר, שהיה מוציא להתרפא אף כל ממונו. Keeping your health, maintaining your health, is worth more to you than 20% of your net worth. And here, this particular patient, who's perfectly healthy at the moment, and they only want to keep him in the hospital under observation to maintain his health, he should not fall again in a relapse and have pain and suffering again. Well, maintaining one's health, preventing the relapse, is surely worth more than 20% of anyone's net worth. Nechshav onus b'mitzvah aseh d'shofru potter, the underlying svara, the underlying reason why pain and suffering exempts you from mitzvahs is because the Gemara already taught us, and all the poskim already taught us, that financial pressure can exempt you from a mitzvah, and pain and suffering is worth more than financial pressure, and therefore exempt. So the underlying idea is not only embraced also by the Igros Moshe, by Rabbi Moshe Feinstein on the current screen, but he explains the conceptual underpinnings of the idea. Since HaKadosh Baruch Hu does not expect you to spend a lot of money, defined as more than 20% of your net worth, in order to perform any particular mitzvah, well, getting sick is worth more than that, and therefore, sickness, either current or sickness resulting from performance of the mitzvah, will exempt you. Rav Moshe Sternbuch, originally from London, today he's the head of the Bet Din of the Eidah Haredit in Mea Sha'arim, putting him at the very pinnacle of the rabbinic world today. He wrote as follows: if performance of a mitzvah is going to make you sick, I do not have a clear answer. Because the answer to the question depends upon your ability to tolerate pain and suffering. Some people have a greater pain tolerance, some people don't, and therefore I have no clear answer that will apply to everyone, because everyone is different in how they experience pain and suffering. But if you are in doubt about whether or not your level of pain and suffering is sufficient to justify an exemption, leniency is the correct way to go. This is similar to what we learn in the Shach, one of the two great commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch, B'Sakonas Eva Sfeiko L'Kul. It should say Sfeiko with a kuf, not a resh. I don't type very well. Just as the Shach taught us that even when it comes to violating Shabbos, because one of your limbs or one of your organs might be in danger, if there's any suffix of danger, any suffix, you're in doubt about whether your ability to tolerate the pain and suffering is large or small. In cases of doubt, leniency is the way to go. If the worst that will happen is that you'll have to lie down for a few minutes, if that's the worst that's going to happen, you have to lie down for a few minutes. I don't think that's enough pain and suffering to exempt you. But of course, every case is different, and bottom line, only you know what your level of suffering is. Now, with this, we've covered the principal opinions of the poskim regarding performance of a mitzvah in general, or matzah in specific, if performance of the mitzvah is going to cause you pain and suffering. We're going to pause at this point. I wish you a good week and a safe week, and eventually a Shabbat Shalom and a Chag Kasher v'Sameach, and look forward to seeing you all again in the continuation of this series in the Web Yeshiva, leading up to Pesach and in our future shiurim. You're welcome. You're welcome.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you.
Thank
You're
you
welcome.
very much. It was very,
My pleasure.
very informative.
Thank you.
You're welcome. You're
Bye.
welcome.
Thank you very much, Rabbi.
You're very welcome.